For more than half a century, one man stood closer to Bruce Lee than almost anyone else alive. He trained with him. He sparred with him. He watched him think, fail, adapt, and redefine combat itself. And yet for decades, Dan Inosanto barely spoke. Now, at an age when most men choose silence, Inosanto chose truth. And what he finally said did not comfort fans, it disturbed them. Because it didn't elevate the myth, it revealed the man. And for some admirers, that honesty felt like betrayal, the silence that lasted a lifetime. For decades after Bruce Lee's death, Dan Inosanto lived with a quiet burden. He was not just a former student, not just a training partner, but one of the very few people who had daily access to Bruce Lee's private world. His doubts, his experiments, his unfinished ideas. While books were written, legends inflated, and myths hardened into certainty, Inosanto remained mostly silent. Not because he lacked stories, but because he believed Bruce Lee's life did not belong to spectacle. That silence lasted more than 40 years. During that time, Bruce Lee was transformed into something almost untouchable. Fans spoke of him as an invincible fighter, a flawless master of every martial art he touched, a man whose abilities bordered on the supernatural. Internet debates turned his name into a battlefield. Any suggestion of limitation was treated as heresy. Inosanto watched all of this unfold and chose not to intervene. Part of that restraint came from loyalty. Inosanto had seen how deeply private Bruce Lee was. He guarded his process. He questioned everything. He disliked being frozen into rigid definitions. Speaking publicly about Bruce meant risking distortion, and Inosanto refused to contribute to that. He once said that Bruce gave everything, his mind, his body, his spirit, and paid the price for pushing beyond limits. That sacrifice deserved respect, not noise, but time changes responsibility. As Inosanto entered his 70s, the myth surrounding Bruce Lee had grown louder than the truth. Younger generations were learning about Bruce not through first-hand accounts, but through internet arguments, exaggerated claims, and increasingly fictional portrayals. Inosanto began to sense that silence was no longer neutral. Silence, he realized, was allowing others to define Bruce in ways that Bruce himself would have rejected. The breaking point did not come from age alone. It came from misrepresentation. When a new generation encountered Bruce Lee through pop culture rather than history, Inosanto understood something painful. If he didn't speak now, the version of Bruce Lee remembered by the world would be written by people who never knew him at all. The film that forced him to speak. The moment that finally broke Dan Inosanto's silence did not come from a book, a rumor, or an online debate. It came from a movie theater. When Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was released, audiences around the world were introduced to a version of Bruce Lee that felt jarringly unfamiliar to those who had known him personally. On screen, Bruce Lee was portrayed as loud, arrogant, dismissive of others, and eager to boast about his own invincibility. For Dan Inosanto, the discomfort was immediate. The character, played by Mike Moe, appears in a scene set on the lot of the Green Hornet, the very show that helped introduce Bruce Lee to American audiences. In the film, Bruce brags that he could cripple heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali before engaging in a staged fight with stuntman Cliff Booth, portrayed by Brad Pitt. The scene ends with Bruce being slammed into a car, visually humbled, his bravado punctured for laughs. To many viewers, it was just a stylized moment in a fictional story. To Inosanto, it was something else entirely. In interviews following the film's release, Inosanto made it clear that the Bruce Lee he knew would never have spoken that way about Ali. He explained that Bruce deeply admired Muhammad Ali, studied him, respected him, and viewed him as a model of athletic intelligence. Inosanto stated plainly that Bruce's philosophy would never allow him to belittle another fighter, especially one he revered. Confidence, yes. Arrogance, no. What troubled Inosanto even more was not just the dialogue, but the implication. The scene suggested that Bruce Lee's confidence was hollow, that his ideas were exaggerated, and that he needed to be put in his place. For someone who had watched Bruce obsessively test himself, question his own methods, and openly acknowledge his limitations, that portrayal felt dishonest. Inosanto was not alone. Shannon Lee, Bruce Lee's daughter, publicly criticized the film, stating that the family had never been consulted. She explained that her father was not an arrogant man and that seeing him reduced to a caricature was painful. Inosanto echoed that sentiment, reinforcing that this was not about ego, but about accuracy. For decades, Inosanto had protected Bruce's privacy by staying quiet. But now, silence felt like complicity. By allowing a fictional version to stand unchallenged, the truth of who Bruce Lee really was risked being lost. And so, reluctantly, Dan Inosanto chose to speak, knowing full well that honesty would come at a cost. The truth that angered the fans. When Dan Inosanto finally began speaking publicly, many fans expected stories that would further elevate Bruce Lee's legend. What they received instead was something far more unsettling: context. And context, for some, felt like an attack. One of the most controversial points Inosanto addressed was Bruce Lee's background in Wing Chun. For years, a widespread belief held that Bruce had fully mastered the system, completed its formal curriculum, and stood at the highest technical level. Inosanto quietly dismantled that assumption. He explained that Bruce Lee did not complete the entire Wing Chun system and was not ranked at the highest level within it. This was not an insult, it was a fact. What angered people was not the information itself, but what it challenged. Inosanto clarified that Bruce Lee's brilliance never came from collecting ranks or completing systems. Bruce did not measure himself by certificates or titles. He measured himself by function. He took what worked, discarded what did not, and moved on without apology. Inosanto used an analogy that cut deeply. Someone may not hold a doctorate, yet still possess PhD-level understanding. Bruce Lee, he explained, was that kind of martial artist. To many fans, this sounded like demystification. To Inosanto, it was the opposite. He explained that Bruce Lee's genius lay precisely in his refusal to stay confined. Bruce understood Wing Chun deeply enough to extract its essence: timing, sensitivity, economy of motion, and then integrate those ideas into a broader, more adaptive structure. As Bruce's training evolved, Wing Chun trapping became one tool among many, not the foundation of everything he did. That shift, Inosanto said, was deliberate. This was where the backlash intensified. Online reactions turned hostile. Some accused Inosanto of diminishing Bruce's legacy. Others claimed he was contradicting history. A portion of fans argued that these details should have remained private, insisting that revealing limitations tarnished the image of an invincible icon. One recurring accusation was especially painful: that Inosanto was rewriting Bruce Lee's story to justify his own approach to martial arts. Inosanto rejected that completely. He emphasized that Bruce Lee openly acknowledged his own limitations while alive. Bruce constantly tested himself, often placing himself in disadvantageous positions during sparring to see how he could recover. He studied boxing obsessively. He questioned point karate. He experimented with protective gear when no one else was doing full contact training. None of this came from insecurity. It came from curiosity. The irony, Inosanto noted, was cruel. The very honesty Bruce Lee lived by was now what some fans refused to accept. In telling the truth, Inosanto wasn't tearing the legend down. He was defending it from becoming something Bruce Lee never wanted to be: frozen, unquestioned, and mythologized beyond recognition. The Bruce Lee they never wanted to see. What angered many fans was not just what Dan Inosanto revealed, but the version of Bruce Lee those revelations described. It was not the untouchable warrior many had grown up believing in. It was something more uncomfortable: a man constantly questioning himself. Inosanto described Bruce Lee as obsessively analytical. He did not train to confirm his superiority. He trained to expose his weaknesses. During sparring sessions, Bruce would intentionally place himself in bad positions, pinned against walls, cramped in confined spaces, or restricted by limited movement, just to see what would fail and what would survive under pressure. He believed that if something only worked under perfect conditions, it wasn't worth keeping. This mindset extended far beyond martial arts. Bruce Lee treated combat like science. He observed, tested, discarded, then rebuilt. Inosanto recalled Bruce spending hours studying boxing matches, not for spectacle, but for rhythm, timing, and efficiency. He preferred the flow of boxing to the stop-start nature of point karate, which he felt interrupted realism. He wanted continuity, broken rhythm, and adaptability, qualities that could survive chaos. That approach led Bruce to experiment in ways that were ahead of his time. Long before modern mixed martial arts existed, Bruce and Inosanto trained in protective gear, shin guards, body protectors, face masks, elbow pads, and boxing gloves, so they could strike with intent instead of restraint. As confidence grew, the armor slowly disappeared. What remained was contact, pressure, and consequence. This was not the behavior of a man who believed himself invincible. Inosanto also addressed a painful misconception, that Bruce Lee was dismissive of other arts. In reality, Bruce respected nearly every system he studied. He admired the discipline of Korean karate, the power of Muay Thai's rear leg, the efficiency of Western boxing, the footwork of fencing, and the conditioning of Southeast Asian systems. His criticism was never about superiority. It was about context. What works on a mat may fail on concrete. What succeeds in open space may collapse on stairs, in a vehicle, or in water. Bruce Lee did not want followers. He wanted thinkers. This is the Bruce Lee many fans struggled to accept. A man who evolved so quickly that no single label could hold him, who never finished anything because he refused to stop growing, and who believed that mastery meant constant revision. To myth keepers, this sounded like weakness. To Inosanto, it was the clearest proof of Bruce Lee's greatness. The loss that never healed. When Bruce Lee died suddenly in Hong Kong, the shock did not move through the martial arts world like a rumor. It hit like a physical blow. He was young. He was at the peak of his creative power. Projects were unfinished, ideas still forming, questions unanswered. For Dan Inosanto, the loss was not abstract. It was immediate and deeply personal. Inosanto was not just mourning a public figure. He was mourning the man he trained with daily, argued with intellectually, laughed with privately, and trusted completely. He served as a pallbearer at Bruce Lee's funeral, standing close enough to feel the finality settle in. Later, he admitted that for a long time, he could not understand how someone so alive, so driven, could simply be gone. Years passed. The world moved on. The legend expanded. But for Inosanto, grief did not fade into memory. At 74, he openly said that there had not been a single day since Bruce's death that he hadn't thought about him. Once, twice, sometimes 5 times a day. Not in nostalgia, but in reflection, in training, in teaching, in moments of quiet. After Bruce Lee's passing, Inosanto made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He left his position as a physical education teacher and committed fully to martial arts instruction. This was not about fame or profit. It was about continuity. He felt a responsibility to preserve what Bruce was trying to build, not a frozen system, but a living process. That responsibility became heavier as misinformation spread. People claimed authority they never earned. Others sold simplified versions of Bruce Lee's ideas, stripped of nuance and context. Inosanto watched as Jeet Kune Do became a label instead of a philosophy. That troubled him deeply, yet he never claimed to replace Bruce Lee. He openly admitted that he did not have Bruce's speed, his explosive power, or his natural gifts. What he did have was proximity, first-hand knowledge of Bruce's direction, intent, and mindset. That, Inosanto believed, mattered more than imitation. The pain of loss shaped how he taught. He emphasized humility, adaptability, and honesty. He warned students against idol worship. Bruce Lee, he reminded them, was human. Exceptional, yes, but human. And it was precisely that humanity that made his achievements meaningful. For Inosanto, speaking up was not reopening old wounds. Those wounds never closed. It was honoring a friend the only way he knew how, by refusing to let his life be rewritten into something false. Why fans are still furious. The anger that followed Dan Inosanto's words did not fade with time. If anything, it hardened. What divided fans was not disagreement over facts, but fear. Fear that admitting complexity would weaken the legend they had built their identity around. For many, Bruce Lee was more than a martial artist. He was proof. Proof that discipline conquers all. Proof that perfection is possible. Proof that one man could stand above limits. Inosanto threatened that certainty. By explaining that Bruce Lee was still learning, still unfinished, still experimenting until his final days, Inosanto shattered the illusion of final mastery. To some fans, this sounded like regression. To others, it sounded like disrespect. Online, accusations intensified. Critics claimed Inosanto was watering down Jeet Kune Do by encouraging cross-training. Others accused him of monetizing Bruce Lee's name while contradicting his legacy. What these critics ignored was the core contradiction in their argument. Bruce Lee himself rejected stagnation. He warned against clinging to forms. He believed that stopping evolution was the fastest way to decay. Inosanto repeatedly stated that freezing Bruce Lee in one era, one curriculum, 1 year, one interpretation, goes directly against everything Bruce stood for. Jeet Kune Do was never meant to be preserved like a museum artifact. It was meant to breathe. This created a deep fracture within the community. One group demanded purity, insisting that only what Bruce Lee taught during specific periods was legitimate. Another group followed Inosanto's approach, seeing Jeet Kune Do as a conceptual framework that must adapt to new environments, new threats, and new bodies. The debate was no longer technical. It became emotional. For Dan Inosanto, the criticism was painful but expected. He never claimed to speak for Bruce Lee's ego. He spoke for Bruce Lee's intent. He understood that some fans would rather protect a myth than accept a human being who questioned himself relentlessly. So what do you think? Was Dan Inosanto right to finally speak honestly about Bruce Lee, or should some truths have remained private? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you see Bruce Lee differently, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more untold stories behind legendary figures.